Check 1 2. Hey, check. Check 1 2. How's your battery? Check 1, 2. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
There's a switch here.
Yeah.
Yeah, just need to
And don't
check.
go to test.
Well,
I hear that's the
it won't sound great,
the
but
mortal sin, whatever sound is to do.
yeah.
Hi there. Hello. How are you? Good. How are you? Hi. I've got a PDF of the presentation that is right in front of you if you want one.
Oh, I thought, are these people to analysts or anything?
No, no, no.
Oh, okay.
It's just me on this line.
Oh,
solo.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
Did you have a room moderator or anything like that?
Nobody's told me.
Or,
Although moderation has never been good.
yeah. If need be, we have an extra microphone, so if you want to ask questions.
I'm gonna try to talk for so long. I have no idea how long my presentation's gonna. But yeah, that's fine. I hopefully not during the presentation so much.
Yeah, I'm okay. Either way. Scared to make sure everything.
No, I appreciate it.
But yeah, if you do, moderator shows up, send it back.
Yeah.
Stuff. So.
Great. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, I know. I was sitting, at least told me I was sitting there.
There are PDF copies of my presentation on the table. If you'd like one.
Yeah, we're yeah. I don't know. We're I was thinking about this. Yeah. The one about decompose. Yeah, they didn't figure out that. It was like I already. No.
Yes, that's what
I had to draw.
as we go along.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's fine. I'm sorry. I'm starting in just a couple of minutes. No, what time is it? Oh, it's 1:15. Oh, okay. It's 1:14. Thanks. What are you doing? Well, Patrick building. Well, by George. Yeah. I don't know.
Sure, yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eliza. I kind of feel like I want to gather us together and make a fire on the beach with this intimate crowd. But I guess that wouldn't be very safe for the building. And it would get me in trouble with the Hilton. Thank you all for being here. I hope that despite the small attendance that I can keep you engaged. And if not, that is perfectly lovely for you to go find what you're looking for elsewhere. But I think Mount Hood room is a beautiful space. So hopefully you will enjoy my presentation. All right, so again, my name is Eliza Galaher, and I am with I'm an education and outreach specialist with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And I cover, in my region, I cover Columbia, Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. I'm an education and outreach specialist. That means I travel those 4 counties, basically doing outreach to folks to help them know what their civil rights are around housing, fair housing laws. And today I'm going to be talking about struggles against the current for fair and affordable housing on the Northwest Oregon coast. I picked this picture initially thinking, well, it's a beautiful photograph of the ocean, but if you look a little more carefully, there's water coming down into the ocean from a river source. And even where the photograph is taken from, it's from within inside a cave. And I just think, well, that says something too, because thousands of years of water and wind has created this erosion to create this cave. So there's just water everywhere in this image. And so that maybe speaks partly to why I chose the title Cold Swift Water. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the title. So this is actually comes from a poem by the writer Raymond Carver. Anybody familiar with Raymond Carver? Yay, one person. Okay, he's a writer, a poet. And I live up in St. Helens in Columbia County. And I was really excited to discover a couple years ago that Raymond Carver was born in Clatskanie, which is in Columbia County. So I chose a little snippet from his poem as the title for my presentation today. And I wanted to share, has anybody shared a poem with you today? Good, okay, well, let me be the first. So this is called Where Water Comes Together with Other Water. I love creeks and the music they make, and rills and glades and meadows before they have a chance to become creeks. I may even love them best of all for their secrecy. I almost forgot to say something about the source. Can anything be more wonderful than a spring? But the big streams have my heart too, and the places streams flow into rivers. The open mouths of rivers where they join the sea, the places where water comes together with other water. Those places stand out in my mind like holy places. But these coastal rivers, I love them the way some men love horses or glamorous women. I have a thing for this cold, swift water. Just looking at it makes my blood run and my skin tingle. I could sit and watch these rivers for hours, not one of them like any other. I'm 45 years old today. Would anyone believe it if I said I was once 35? My heart empty and sear at 35. 5 more years had to pass before it began to flow again. I'll take all the time I please this afternoon before leaving my place alongside this river. It pleases me loving rivers, loving them all the way back to their source, loving everything that increases me. And when he says loving everything that increases me, I don't see that as an egotistical me. I see it as everything that increases the kind of the Walt Whitman-esque me, the every me, the humanity me. So I love this because it makes me connect with water, obviously, and nature, and a sense of being with the ocean and other sources of water. And hopefully this might kind of trickle through the thoughts you have today as I give my presentation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about fair housing. So I'm with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We're a nonprofit civil rights organization. And we were established in 1990. We're a statewide organization. But the work we do is all based on the 1968 Fair Housing Act. How many people are familiar with the 1968 Fair Housing Act? Okay, somewhat, good, okay. So a really important law that was passed in 1968, exactly 1 week after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was not something that was done easily, lightly, or had kind of come through the hallways to President Lyndon B. Johnson's desk easily. There had been a lot of resistance, and there was a huge sense of urgency when Lyndon B. Johnson finally signed into law the Fair Housing Act due to the assassination of Dr. King and what came afterwards. So the original protected classes under the Fair Housing Act were race, color, national origin, and religion. So that's 1968. It wasn't until 1974 that sex was added as a protected class, thanks to the women's movement. Up until then, women couldn't have their own credit cards. They couldn't necessarily buy a house, because if I was a single woman and came to ask for a mortgage loan, they could say, little lady, I just don't know if you're gonna do this without your husband. Get a husband first, then come back, right? So that's kind of what was happening before sex was added as a protected class. And much later, under the protected class of sex came survivors of domestic violence, sexual orientation, and gender identity. They fall under that category of sex. In 1988, both familial status and disability were added as protected classes under the Fair Housing Law. That means people raising children under the age of 18, no matter who you are, you could be a grandmother, an aunt, a godparent, a gay uncle, whatever, you are protected raising that child, and your child is as well. Disability means physical disabilities or mental health struggles. It also includes addiction, which kind of falls under the umbrella of both physical and mental disabilities. So with federal law, that's kind of the foundation for fair housing. And then we also have, each state is allowed to add additional supplemental protected classes. So the protected classes Oregon has include marital status. So you can't be turned away from housing if you're a widow, or if you're in a domestic partnership but not married, or if you're single. Source of income is a huge one. I always say it's a huge one because in the work I've done for the past almost 9 years, I've had so many clients who say, I went to try to apply for housing and the landlord didn't take Section 8. Everybody familiar with what Section 8 vouchers are? Okay. So basically, source of income means that it's illegal to deny someone housing based on their source of income. So it's illegal to turn down people if they have a Section 8 voucher, or if they have rental assistance from, say, community action team or something like that, okay? That also includes temporary assistance for needy families and Social Security, even though that's not written specifically into the law. There are cases that have been won where people have said, I have my Social Security, that needs to be, that's a legitimate source of income for me to pay for my housing. Also, sexual orientation and gender identity, that's not a duplication. Oregon was leading the way in 2008. Those became protected classes under Oregon law. And then the rest of the country decided we better be cool like Oregon, and also made sexual orientation and gender identity protected classes. And then additionally, there are local laws. So local jurisdictions can also have protected classes additional to what these are here. Just a couple of examples in Portland. Occupation is a protected class under fair housing. So that means, for example, if you were like, let's say you were working at the Q Center or, an LGBTQ place and your landlord was a, very faithful Christian and didn't like your work, that would be discriminatory. Or if you were a stripper or an exotic dancer, as long as, if that's the way you're making your money and paying for your rent and getting your child clothes, it's a legitimate occupation, okay? So that's only in local jurisdictions. So I don't know where you all are from, but it's good to look and see your local jurisdiction, say, are there any additional protected classes where I live? Just a little bit about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Our mission is to promote justice, equity, and inclusion in housing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about equity right now. And I really could go, this could be the whole presentation because I have a lot of feelings about this. But so are people created equal? Ideally, yes, we proclaim as a country that everybody's equal, right? We talk a good talk, but we can certainly see in today's political climate, there's a lot of disagreement about who's more equal than others, or are we really equally equal? I was just, in the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal. And I like to think, that was just a semantic thing. They meant all people. But, you think about it today, what we're looking at, did they mean all people or did they really mean men, and specifically white men, cis men? That's up for debate these days. I know what I want to believe. I want to believe that they really meant people. And if we look at the Constitution, it says we the people, right? It doesn't say we the men in order to establish a more perfect union. It says we the people. And we've made strides over the centuries to make sure that we're talking more about the people than just the men, and not just the white men, and not just the cis white men, right? We've got the 14th Amendment. We've got the 19th Amendment, which gave votes to women, right? So we're kind of like making that more perfect union as we go along. But because we didn't have a clear understanding of what all people meant when we began, folks like the guy on the far left got a lot more access to opportunity than someone like the woman on the right, okay? And it's been that way for centuries, and there's been pushback and striving to get everybody equal access to same opportunities. So what we've seen a lot is that while the man might get that really tall ladder, like, oh, I want to go to college. Okay, and he's up, right? The woman's like, yeah, I want to go to college too. I still can't reach because this opportunity is being taken from me because all I'm being given is this ladder. Or maybe they've actually made 2 steps down for me, right? And so equity is the idea of, maybe this guy's gotten far enough. Let's get the ladder to the woman for a minute or two or a few centuries. Let's give her access to the same opportunities that he has been given for centuries. Okay, so when I'm talking about the counties I'm going to be talking about today, I want also, you choose the poem or this, to be thinking about in your mind about equity, that access to the same opportunities, and how do we give that to everyone? So Oregon's Northwest Coast. This is a map I have on my wall in my house, and it's the region I cover in my work. So I live in Columbia County, way over St. Helens over there. I'm not going to be talking about Columbia County today because it doesn't qualify as what we call one of the recreation counties, and I'll explain that a little bit. But you see Clatskanie up there where Raymond Carver was born. But I am going to be talking about Clatsop County, Tillamook County, and Lincoln County today. And so my work takes me all up and down those counties. If you ever if you're involved or interested in fair housing and you have any connection with these counties, please connect with me after the presentation. I'd love to connect with you and see how I can be of help and service. So of course, it's important to acknowledge that before these places had their names and their borders and pre-colonization, this land belonged to indigenous people. And you can see the names of the people who were all over these lands, the Silets, the Nestucca, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, Tillamook, Nehalem, Clatskanie, Clatsop, Cathlamet, Skilut, Multnomah. And I didn't get a count for how many people were there, but I will tell you that as far as land coverage goes, it was about 2,755,100 acres of land. That was where the indigenous people were living in the areas I'm talking about today. This is what it looks like today. Those two little red boxes are where the indigenous people are reserved for indigenous people today. The little red box on top is the Grand Ronde Reservation. And the Grand Ronde people, they have about 11,000 acres. And the Silots have about 15,000 acres, 14,000 of which are timberland. And about the remaining 600 acres are reserved for housing and cultural preservation. Okay, so that's a big difference. Okay, so that's where we are today with indigenous people living on the lands I'm talking about today. So in 2022, if we're looking at that same land, you see that there's a lot of land is forest land, right? So we've got the ocean bordering one side of the counties and forest land bordering the other sides. And let me tell you a little bit about the forest land. So you've got obviously large private forest land, state public, federal government, small private, tribal forest land. As I mentioned, the Silots use most of their land for timberland. So that creates limitations for how many people can live on the coast and how much housing can go up. Still, as I remember from my childhood and from my adulthood, people love to drive through those forests over the Cascade Range to get to some popular tourist destinations, okay? So we've got up in the upper left-hand corner is Astoria, and that's land of the Goonies. I don't know if it's the Goonies or Goonies. So it's land of Goonies, breweries, farmers markets, cafes. I love going there myself. And then we've got Seaside with its boardwalks and its shops, shopping outlet malls, and so on and so forth. Cannon Beach on the upper right-hand corner with Haystack Rock, art galleries. My favorite, Bruce's Candy Kitchen, which has been there since I was a child in the 1970s. Then Manzanita follows, and this is photograph, I believe, is taken from the top of Neocani Mountain, so beautiful hiking there. Then we've got Tillamook, with the Tillamook Creamery that brings in 1.3 million tourists a year. And then Lincoln City down here, which also has beautiful beaches and shops and tourist sites. Now, those are just a few of the destinations, but those are some of the most popular destinations for people that are going through those forests over the Cascade Range to get a break from their city life. Speaking of cities, I want to talk a little bit about Portland, because Portland's the biggest city in Oregon, and it's grown pretty exponentially in the past few decades. I'll tell you, I was living right about in that second plateau growing up here. And then I left and suddenly Portland became hip. So I don't know if they just needed to get rid of me first or what, but around 1980, there was a significant steep climb in people coming to Portland to live. I would like to think it's thanks to the 1977 Trailblazers when they won the NBA championship. Anybody remember Bill Walton, Maurice Lucas? Thank you. Okay, that was 1977. So it took a few years for people to say, yes, I actually want to move there in 1980. But seriously, there were also movies began to be made in the area. We've got 1980, The Shining. Parts of The Shining were filmed here. We've got a Drugstore Cowboy, My Own Private Idaho. Gus Van Sant moved to Portland. And then we also have things like Nike and Adidas and the .com industry, which also created that boom, right? I would like to think more it was like I said, the Trailblazers than the .com industry. But so with that boom in Portland's population comes more demand for activities and just getting away and spaces, recreational activities. And that was easy. It is easy, right? If you're leaving from Portland, you can zip up Highway 30 to Astoria. You can wave to me in St. Helens on your way to Astoria if you want. You can go on Highway 26 to get to Cannon Beach or Seaside. You can cut over down Highway 6 to get to Tillamook. You can go down Highway 18 to get to Lincoln City and then shoot down to Newport. Very easy access from our biggest city and our growing city, Portland. So because of this, this increase in population in Portland and increased need for recreation spaces, some counties in Oregon become what are called recreation counties. And there's a way that a county is designated as a recreation county. According to the Department of Agriculture, they take the types of employment in that county, the total tourism-based earnings, and then also they take into account the percentage of vacation housing units intended for seasonal or occasional use. Okay, so I'm not going to go deeply into the calculations, but I will tell you that Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln, and also Curry and Deschutes and Hood River are all designated as recreation counties due to the all these three elements coming into play. So you've got a big city with growing needs. You've got recreation counties really easily available. But what happens with that, with growing populations come growing pains. And that's what I'm going to talk about a bit now. This is from the Oregon Center for Public Policy. Here you see that poverty rate is higher in rural counties than it is in urban counties. So in Clatsop County, poverty rate is 10.5%. In Tillamook, it's 15%. And in Lincoln County, it's 16.7%. So 16.7% of the people living in Lincoln County are living in poverty. So you're thinking, okay, these are recreation counties, but look, these are also have higher poverty rates. And along with that poverty comes higher distress. And listen, I'd rather talk about a Raymond Carver poem than about numbers, but I think this is important information to have. Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln County all qualify as what are called distressed counties. You'll see the relative unemployment rates. So basically, the lower the number, the higher the distress. Okay, so the most distressed county is Lincoln County, and it's also one of the it's got the most recreation happening in it. Clatsop comes close after that, and then Tillamook. I've got some other figures here, relative per capita personal income. Those all score low. Tillamook's a little higher. Oh no, I'm sorry, Clatsop is a little higher. So all three of these counties that I'm talking about today, these kind of destination sites, are also distressed sites. Now, so you've got poverty, you've got distress, and you've got, a high quotient for leisure and hospitality employment. So what this means is that if the number scores higher in an area than in other areas for people working in the leisure and hospitality industry, then that means it's more dependent on leisure and hospitality for its employment. So Clatsop County and Lincoln, and as I said, Curry down below, are all heavily dependent on the leisure and hospitality industry for employment. That's from the state of Oregon Employment Department. So they're the most distressed counties, and they're also the most leisure and hospitality dependent, and Tillamook is close behind. So with higher demand for this leisure and hospitality, you get more of these kinds of jobs, these kinds of employment at higher rates. And these are at higher rates than in recreation rural counties than in non-recreation rural counties. But jobs in these industries also lean toward lower wages. So while the average income in recreation counties can be higher than in non-recreation rural counties, so is the cost of living. And one thing that results is rent-burdened homes. So what is the definition of a rent-burdened household? A household who spends more than 30% of their income on housing. So everybody can do their own calculations. Am I rent-burdened? In Oregon's rural counties, the average percentage is actually higher. It's 37.5%. Now we're going to look a little bit more closely at the 3 counties we're talking about today. So in Clatsop County, if we're looking at about 37 in rural counties, 1 out of 6 renters pays more than 50% of their income in rent. These are the people that the vacationers, the tourists are relying on for their leisure and their hospitality. Okay, 2 out of 3 renters, so that's majority, with extremely low incomes pay more than 50% of their incomes in rent. In Tillamook County, 1 out of 4 renters pays more than 50% of their income in rent. That's where 1.3 million tourists are coming to the Tillamook Creamery every year. 5 out of 6 renters with extremely low incomes pay more than 50% of their incomes in rent. In Lincoln County, 1 out of 4 renters pays more than 50% of their income in rent, and 3 out of 5 renters with extremely low incomes pay more than 50% of their incomes in rent. One of the results that we see with this extreme rent burden and struggles with poverty are the number of children experiencing homelessness in these counties. Now, I will note that this was calculated in the 2019-2020 school year. So that's when COVID hit. So this might influence the numbers a little bit. But in Clatsop, 1 in 15 children were homeless. In Tillamook, 1 in 21. And in Lincoln County, 1 in 7 children experienced homelessness. So imagine being a teacher in your classroom and thinking, okay, I've got 25, 30 kids in my classroom. What percentage of them don't have a home right now? These are the children of the workers who are doing the leisure and hospitality work to make sure that the people coming over the Cascade Range are getting the vacations and the leisure that they want. So here's a big point of controversy, and I have no idea what businesses y'all work for, except for Samuel, because I work with him. But I don't know if this is going to be a sticky point for people listening to me talk today. But if you look up short-term rentals on the coast in Oregon, you're going to see a lot of debate of whether they're a good thing or a not so good thing for the economy on the coast. So I'll share with you, and I'm also talking about not just short-term rentals, but also seasonal housing, vacation housing. So this is from a January 6, 2022 article written by journalist Erica Bolstad. She writes, postcards with big promises began showing up in mailboxes in Oregon coastal communities in 2019. And what the postcards said were, rent your home short term, use it when you want to, guaranteed $5,000 more monthly income than you're earning with your current property management firm. The article goes on to say that internet-based services such as Airbnb, Vacasa, and Vrbo had been bumping up against short-term rental caps in nearby towns, so they began aggressively soliciting property owners in quieter, unincorporated seaside neighborhoods where there were fewer restrictions on rentals. And over the next year, the number of licensed short-term rentals in unincorporated neighborhoods in Lincoln County grew from 385 to 601. So that's a significant bump, and that's just in one area, right? So short-term rentals, let's talk a little bit more about them, because in my view, they do play a major role in what's happening on the coast as far as wealth gaps and also homelessness issues. So one of the first issues we have is short-term rentals basically creating nuisances. So you've got, sometimes there's over occupancy, there's more noise. So without the landlord being right there, or without it being a long-term rental, people just come and go. And they're like, I need to just let go. I'm going to party loud and hard. And then I'm going to go and I'll be gone. Right. But the people who live there full time, they have to suffer the consequences. So there's been, advocacy for, hey, can we lower the occupancy limit cap on short-term rentals? Because what happens is the noise goes up. There's also parking inconveniences where you get more cars parked in one space, sometimes even blocking roads. And it damages, it has a really negative impact on the septic systems, which many people rely on. So those are some of the things that happen as far as nuisances go. Plus, I was sitting in a Tillamook County Commissioners meeting, and they were talking about how law enforcement has a really limited capacity in rural areas, right? Sometimes you have to drive, from one end of the county to the other if you're a sheriff to check on something. And so if somebody calls with a complaint about short-term rentals, by the time the sheriff gets there, it's all covered up, or the issue is they don't see it, they don't witness it, so they can't do anything about it. Law enforcement has to actually witness the violation to be able to do something about it. So this is kind of ongoing. And I would say this is, in my view, this is not one of the worst issues, because a lot of this doesn't have to do with people who are facing homelessness. It's more the people who are living there and are feel the nuisance of these folks. But it's not people who are feeling like, that house used to be mine. That's more the concern I have. Then we also get vacant spaces and burdened people. This is from a study by Kirsten Ray, who's works in the Portland field office for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. She wrote in a study called Recreation Counties and Available Housing in Oregon. She said, Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties have the highest vacancy rates in Oregon as a percentage of their total housing stock. In analyzing these three counties more closely, removing the total number of vacant seasonal, recreational, or occasional homes from the total number of vacant homes reveals that seasonal, recreational, or occasional homes play a significant role in the number of available housing units. So what that means is, if I'm looking for housing, and it appears to me initially that there are lots of vacant places and, oh, I can move into one of them. But when you subtract the places that are reserved for vacation rentals, all of a sudden there's only this many places to choose from. So that's what that means. As far as rising property costs and displacement, Kirsten Ray also writes, Tillamook County can be studied as a case study to further understand the connection between vacation homes and housing shortages. A housing study created for Tillamook County establishes two zones in the county: a strong coastal market in which more expensive homes are often purchased with cash, and a weaker interior market in which less expensive homes are often purchased with the assistance of conventional or subsidized loans. She goes on to say, the more expensive seasonal homes on the coast support tourism industry that creates low-paying jobs. In turn, this leads to a more challenging housing market in the interior regions of the county where low-wage workers can afford housing. So the people who are living on the coast, working in hospitality and leisure, find themselves being kind of pushed into inland so that they can actually afford housing there, because the housing, where they have grown up is now becoming unaffordable. So in the interior regions of the county, low-wage workers can afford housing, and yet the more affordable interior market is saturated to the point that 56% of low-wage workers who work in Tillamook County live outside the county. They can't even afford to live in their county. And then, of course, that adds gas prices to their transportation in order to be able to work. Okay, so that's some of the effects that can come up when you have an increase in short-term rentals and vacation homes: rising housing costs, unaffordability. The workforce is pushed inland or away from the very place that they may have grown up. And then there's the issue of taking sides. This is not a resolved issue, but I was looking into Lincoln County, and there's an article in the August 15th Yahats News by Quentin Smith that chronicles the struggle in Lincoln County to slow down the growth of short-term rentals. So on the one hand, there's a group called 15 Neighborhoods that argues through a democratic process, citizens legitimately voted 58 to 42% to phase out short-term rentals in residentially zoned areas of unincorporated Lincoln County, to push back against that aggressive campaign from like Airbnb and Vacasa and so on and so forth. So it was a democratically decided issue. It also, the measure also included lowering occupancy limits and requiring septic inspections and improvements. However, the measure was quickly challenged in circuit court by pro short-term rental groups like Via Oregon, and went on to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. And I believe that that whole issue is still being debated at this time, but it's a sample of the kind of debates that are happening up and down Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, is people who are saying, and I will tell you that most of the people I hear saying that short-term rentals are good for the economy are the people who own them or the people who benefit most from them. Feel free to prove me wrong at some point. Yes, sir. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer your question, but I'll go ahead. Sure. Let's see what happens. Yeah. I mostly it's about bringing money, cash flow into the economy, you know, for those leisure and hospitality workers, generating. I'm economics is not my strength, but I don't have really good examples for you. I'm sorry about that. If after, do you have an insight? Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. So you've lived it. You've lived it. Yeah. Go ahead, ma'am. Well, there's so much happening and so much fighting back and forth. I know in Clatsop County, for instance, which is where Cannon Beach is, there have been caps, but then there were also some real just like let them loose ideas in some unincorporated areas, like in Arch Cape, not Arch Cape specifically, but I think it's called Falcon Cove, right? Huge debates and hostility and animosity happening in there because of that one spot being county commissioners just saying, have at it. So Cannon Beach, so incorporated areas, there are caps. Where the real battle seems to happen is in unincorporated areas. It is the Wild West. Yes. I think I saw one more hand up. Yes. If I can repeat the questions. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Zoom monitor. Can I just call you Zoom? No. So the question was basically, what evidence what examples are there of the pro short-term rental folks and the advantages of short-term rentals economically? Is that fair? Yeah. And then it just went all over the place. How's that? Okay. I will try to repeat questions though. And then somebody affirmed what I was talking about in his lived experience. And then someone also asked a point of clarity about Cannon Beach and has there been a cap on short-term rentals? So those were the questions that came up. All right, so I need to do a time check. Oh, wow, okay. I have to what, 2:45, okay. Whew. Okay, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Tillamook. Who's been to the Tillamook Creamery before? I don't know if that's the exact right term. I just went there for the first time a couple summers ago. It was fascinating. So I'm gonna tell you a tale of tourists and workers in Tillamook. This is according to a December 20th, 2018 article by journalist Brenna Visser, who writes for the Daily Astorian and the Seaside Signal and the Cannon Beach Gazette. In the article, she's referring to a study by the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. And she says, despite the fact that coastal communities have built an above average amount of housing between 2000 and 2016, new development was mostly on vacation or seasonal homes. While there was an overall increase in vacation homes, the stock of workforce housing barely increased. Vista goes on to write, Tillamook County's numbers were particularly dramatic. Roughly 2,000 new units were built between the year 2000 and 2014, but the county overall lost more than 100 units of non-seasonal housing. Now, I will say that most recently, there is a new apartment complex there, affordable housing called Holden Creek, that has 60 units. So maybe it's evened up a little bit, but there's still a lack of affordable housing in Tillamook. So far, I've mostly been talking about the affordability issue on the coast, especially in Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the fairness issue. Remember, going back to the protected classes I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So please forgive me for my title, but I cannot help a pun. How fairness in housing is faring. All right, don't forgive me. I'm shameless. I want to talk first about source of income. I mentioned that before, that source of income is a protected class in Oregon law. So again, I don't know what work y'all do, except for now, Sam and Gina. But if you know someone who is trying to get stabilized again, trying to reunify with their family, that's a lot of the work I did previously, was stabilization of families and reunification of families. If they are feeling more and more defeated because they cannot find somebody that takes Section 8, tell them, you know what's actually happening to you? You're being discriminated against, because it's illegal to turn someone away if they have a Section 8 voucher. That's a source of income, is a protected class. And I've seen it. So I worked for 3 years in child welfare. And then I worked for about 4 years as a kind of an in-home visitor for families before taking on this job. All the time, that was a story that people had. My landlord doesn't take Section 8. They're just trying to get out of their sober housing and finally back into their own home so they can be back with their child. I didn't know either that it was illegal to do that. So I just thought, okay, come on, hang in there. We'll find somebody, right? Now I know. I wish I'd known then. I could say, well, let's go talk to that landlord. We're going to talk to them. We're not going to listen to them. We're going to give them a talking to. No, I mean, a lot of landlords don't know either. Or maybe there are a little bit more malicious, or whatever the word might be, selfish in their intentions, and don't want their places to get inspected, because they have to be inspected if you're going to take a Section 8 voucher. But you know what? Don't you want your house to pass inspection? I mean, isn't that, if you're going to be a landlord or a housing provider, wouldn't it be nice if you were providing housing that would pass inspection? And actually, Section 8 vouchers are a very reliable source of income for housing providers. There may be more paperwork to do and so on and so forth, but it's a consistent form of income. So that's one thing that happens on the coast and everywhere in Oregon, is people not knowing their rights about source of income. Then there are people, and I've worked a lot with this population as well, people with living with disabilities. And obviously there's a huge intersection. There's a, there's a web of protected classes that one person can belong to, right? You could be a person of color, a queer person of color with a disability, domestic violence survivor, right? So many people are those multi-protected classes. People living with disabilities can mean people living with physical disabilities. And so the struggle with them is often getting reasonable accommodations for their housing. I need a ramp. I need to be able to get into my house. It's called access to, sorry, it's been a while, equal access to or equal enjoyment of a dwelling. And so I'm going to do a reasonable accommodation request for a ramp to be built. Now, here's unfortunately a little catch is if it's a private landlord, the tenant has to pay for it. If it's public housing, it's up to the housing provider to pay for the ramp. I say it's a catch because a lot of people who need that ramp cannot afford to build it or don't have people to help them build it. And then they also have to pay for it to be taken down as well. And then unfortunately, I've heard of some folks like community action teams who have some funding for people. So yes, we can help fund your ramp, but we only do it for people 65 and over. If you're in a wheelchair, you're in a wheelchair. You need to get into your dwelling, right? So those are some of the things that are happening as far as people living with disabilities and housing. Now there's mental health as well is considered a disability. If it significantly impairs any kind of particular activity in your life. And so often what there is people have histories with their mental health. And so landlords are like, I know you, right? I know what kind of behavior you've exhibited. And they don't know that people don't know they can say, yes, I have maybe a poor criminal history, or I have a poor credit history, I have poor rental history because of my mental health. This is what I'm doing now to take care of it. And here's some verification. People don't know that they can do that. So that's part of what Fair Housing Council of Oregon does, is we train people to empower themselves to be able to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to cross my fingers and hope you don't see that background when you do my application process. I'm going to tell you right now up front, you're going to find something. And here's what I'm doing to change. And here's verification from my doctor or my spiritual advisor or my AA sponsor to show that I'm changing, right? So we need to be taking into mind the kind of those kind of barriers that are happening on the coast as well. Clearly, if most housing, as we talked about in Tillamook County, is being built as vacation housing, they're not necessarily taking into consideration folks with either mental health struggles or physical disabilities. I was going to say something. Another thing that happens is whether it's because it's a rural community and they don't have the funding, there's lack of community services in these areas. I work with those folks, the folks that are working day and night tirelessly. But I'll tell you, in Columbia County, there's only one mental health clinic. In Clatsop County, I think there's only one mental health clinic. Tillamook might have two. Lincoln County, maybe two. But they're all overwhelmed with the need of their community, and they're also understaffed. And so there's turnover and so on and so forth. And those are the barriers that are facing people in these rural areas. And there's also more invisible disabilities that we don't necessarily know of. Veterans, unfortunately, are not protected classes in and of themselves, but a lot of veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that should be considered a disability and taken into consideration if we want to have fair, affordable housing on the coast and anywhere in Oregon. So other things that need to be taken into consideration as we're living in these coastal communities and trying to support them and trying to develop them in a mindful way is, what are the transportation systems like for people who have disabilities? What is the internet access like for people with disabilities, especially with COVID, when we think about, having your appointments over Zoom? If you're living somewhere inland, like in Otis or something, maybe you're not going to have internet access and you're not going to get the care you need as somebody living with a disability. Meanwhile, the person with a nice vacation house high up with a beautiful ocean view sits at their computer all day with internet access. I don't know if that's true. I get a little snippy, a little cynical about it sometimes. We also have increasing concerns for our elders, not only on the coast, but really on the coast. I've talked with someone who's an in-home care provider. There are very few affordable assisted living facilities on the coast. There are foster homes, but those are more expensive. And a lot of people fall right between that crack of like being able to use Medicaid and not being able to use Medicaid. And elders are being displaced from their homes because they can't afford assisted living on the coast in the few assisted living facilities that there are. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from, I listened to a presentation given by a woman named Karen Brown Wilson of Age Plus. And she said that by 2035, which is not that far from now, 14 of Oregon's 36 counties are projected to have at least 30% of their population 65 years old or older. I think I will fall into that category. 50% of older Oregonians will live in either suburban or rural areas. So a lot of seniors are going to be living in these rural areas, but not be able to afford living in these rural areas. So that's about location. Then she talked about suitability. She said that only 4% of single family homes are accessible to people with disabilities, 4%. 41% of adults ages 65 to 79 years old and 71% of adults 80 years old or older live with at least one disability. It's often a mobility issue. Could be mental health, could be physical health, could be a combination of both. But I can tell you, as someone who's beginning to, well, I talk too much about my age, but as someone who's seeing that on my horizon, it's scary to think about what's going to be accessible down the road. And then there's the cost of living. Karen Brown Wilson says that the median personal income for rural Oregonians 75 years old or older, for men, it's about $27,000 a year. For women, it's about $17,000 a year. So that's not a lot to live off of if you're 75 years old or older living in rural Oregon. And she also notes that 50 to 65% of renters 65 years and older spend 30% more or more of their income on housing. So that little bit of money they have is going to housing. And on top of that, single person household average costs for utilities, food, and healthcare is about $1,100 per month. So you're left with maybe 50 cents. I'm not going to do the math, but basically you're left with very little money to get by. She also notes that Medicaid does not pay for many needed services outside of assisted living facilities. So many seniors who are trying to stay home, they can't afford the in-home services. So they either have a choice of I'll stay home and feel I have got some independence, but I won't get any help, or I'll have to live in an assisted facility in order to get help. But guess what? I can't really afford to live in that assisted facility. So adults are in a real catch-20. I'm sorry, not adults, seniors are in a real catch-22 as far as living in the rural areas. And then as far as assisted living availability, as I said, there are very few affordable assisted living facilities on the coast. So according to assistedliving.org, the monthly median cost of an assisted living facility in Oregon is $4,593. And that's above national average. And according to one director at an Oregon assisted living facility, there's a 2 to 3 year waiting list on many facilities, and they require a deposit to even get on the waiting list. So you have to have money to get on the waiting list, and then you have to wait 2 to 3 years while you're wondering, am I going to be able to stay in my own home? Am I going to be able to be cared for, right? So distressed counties takes on a whole different meaning when we're talking about senior citizens. I mentioned briefly survivors of domestic violence. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, on average, 1 in 3 women in the US will experience rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner. Of Columbia, Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, and I know I'm really talking about the coastal counties, the Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln, there's 1 domestic violence shelter per county. And I work with those folks, and they're small shelters. And if a room opens, it is gone in a second. There are people waiting to get in. But the problem that the shelters are seeing is that often these shelters can only house people for a little while because they want to be able to keep bringing people in. Then there's no longer term transitional housing for these survivors of domestic violence. And there's a bottleneck. And also, these are people who are working full time, but are still in poverty. So if you don't have many options for getting out of the shelter once you feel like you've stabilized, what's one option? Go back to your perpetrator. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only option, and it's obviously not one I condone, but it is one that happens. If people don't have a safe place to live and they've got a child, they're going to think, maybe I would just be safer if I went back to my abuser. And again, survivors of domestic violence under the protected class of sex are a protected class under federal housing laws. And just by the way, Fair Housing Council can do a whole training on survivors of domestic violence and how that applies to them as far as fair housing. LGBTQ plus folks. I am very proud to say that a couple weekends ago, I, as an employee of Fair Housing Council of Oregon, got to attend Newport's, I think first, LGBTQ Pride event. That was a couple Saturdays ago. 300 people were there. There was fear, though. It was an indoor event. It was all in the gym. There was fear. There were threats of folks with guns, going to be waiting for us outside. So we didn't do anything outside. We did it all inside the gym. But there were 300 people. But I've been working pretty closely with a trans woman who works down in the Lincoln County area. And she tells me her own personal story of being turned away from a rental unit simply with the landlord saying, we don't take your type, right? And this is a woman who contributes more to that county than many people I know. She's a hardworking person. She tells me stories of non-binary teens who can't get into shelters or don't feel safe in shelters because maybe the rooms are very gendered. So they don't feel safe in either room. So they prefer to be homeless and on the streets instead of in shelters. Now, there's how does this go back to what I'm talking about as far as wealth gaps and poverty on the coast? It's all tied together. It's all about visibility. It's all about what I was talking about with equity. Are we giving the tall ladder to everybody or just to some people when we're looking at housing, when we're looking at safety, when we're looking at education, when we're looking at health, right? We need to be thinking, are we treating people equitably? Because we may claim that we're all equal, but it did not start out that way. So we need to be thinking about equity, giving people that access they need to safe housing. And if you're a family, remember familial status is also a protected class. So if you're a family and you've got either a gay parent or a gay child and you're being harassed, you can also speak out and advocate for yourself under fair housing laws, just so you know that. The other troubling thing about LGBTQ folks is sometimes there's so much invisibility that there just aren't statistics out there to be able to say how much homelessness there is, how much abuse or rejection there is, how much bullying there is, because people don't want to speak out. It's kind of like, I belong to that community. I know that when I was younger, I was bullied, right? You don't, in 1980s especially, you don't feel like stepping up and saying, hey, I deserve to be treated fairly because there's so much stigma. And of course, there's going to be more stigma in rural areas than there are in urban areas. So that's one community as well that can be affected by basically privilege, by wealth gaps, by poverty. And then there's also agricultural labor housing, and going from labor housing to homes, real homes for workers. I had the real privilege in August of going to the Mexican consulate is doing these mobile events. And I went to one in Tillamook in August, where basically what they're doing is they're setting up places where Mexican citizens can get their passports renewed. so that they can safely be here and also safely get back to Mexico if they want to, or, they have forms of identification, right? So I would got to be there just as kind of a tabling person for Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And that mobile event was full all day long. People coming all day long, whole families coming. And according to the US Census Bureau, people who identify as Latinx make up about 13% of the Oregon coast population. So there's a large Latinx population on the Oregon coast, and that's actually the whole coast, not just Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln. And that number, just because that's the number of Latinx folks doesn't mean that's the number of agricultural workers. I don't want to make that assumption at all, but there is a thriving community there. Are they thriving as far as being able to get housing and being treated equitably? Well, according to, I'll tell you, according to the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and my experiences working with Latinx folks and their advocates, there's a lot of discrimination happening, whether it's a landlord immediately asking someone for their social security card, right? Just the folks who might be immigrants, right? That is illegal to do. If you're going to ask one person for their social security card when they're applying, you need to ask everybody for it. And one of the things Fair Housing Council of Oregon does is we supply a list of alternative identifications for folks so that you can get around that. You don't need to prove you're a citizen. It's not illegal to rent to an undocumented person. You just need to be able to show identification to prove you are who you are. That's what we need to be doing. There's also things like linguistic bias, where if you have an accent that maybe sounds like you're not from the United States of America, maybe the landlord doesn't return your call, or maybe they turn you down or treat you differently. Okay, that's all discrimination. But I just want to point out that in an article by Shannon Sollett, who writes for the Capital Press, she said there's been a real shift in farm worker demographics. She said in the early 2000s, roughly 50% of Oregon farm workers were seasonal migrant workers, and they were living, they do live in these very minimalistic, minimally comfortable kind of shacks or sheds, right? But now 84% of farm workers are long-term residents or want to be, and who want to settle into one community. And these workers are looking for permanent housing for them and their families. For a long time, these labor housing, also known as labor camps, didn't supply for the families. It's like, you're the worker, you can stay here, right? So I just want to point out that there's discrimination, and these are hardworking people that are working in our canneries, people working on the farms, right? And who are contributing to that rich leisure and hospitality environment that people are benefiting from. That's another population we need to be mindful of, and being negatively impacted by wealth differences and just housing differences and treatment. I'm going to talk about the wildfire that happened on Echo Mountain for a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of lower income people have to be kind of forced to move inland. And I'm not saying the people that live in Otis were forced to live in Otis. Otis is a beautiful place. But lower income folks. So in 2020, what happened was that there was a wildfire, much smaller than other wildfires at the same time that were happening in Southern Oregon. But Echo Mountain in the town of Otis, April and May of 2020 had the lightest rainfall in Oregon since 1924. And from an AP article by Jillian Flacus, she says, warming climate means snows on mountains melt earlier, leaving soil and vegetation parched by late summer. So think about it. Instead of these long, glorious springs with melts, we just get a quick melt earlier in the spring, and it's all soaked up. And by the end of the summer, it looks like my front yard, dry soil, parched. And this, in combination with 50-mile-an-hour winds, made for a dangerous setup, and just one spark needed to create a wildfire that covered 2,500 acres and destroyed 300 homes at the Salmon River Mobile Village in Otis. So lower income folks being negatively impacted by where they're living, where they're being made to live, but also there's a climate issue happening here, right? And that impacts the coast as well. We're getting close to the end, folks, so just hang in there. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about factors of climate change in Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. So some of the factors of climate change, our shorelines are changing. We've got rising sea levels. We've got more energetic storm patterns. I think the word energetic is a fairly euphemistic one. We could say violent or angry or aggressive. And there's increased erosion. That's what's happening with the shorelines due to climate change. As far as our ecosystems, we've got submerged lands, waterlogged soils, plant deaths, acidification of waters, negative impact on shellfish, and that has a negative impact on the shellfish industry. And there's earlier and stronger river melts affect salmon eggs. So the people working in the fishing industry, they're negatively impacted. As far as developers go, they're dealing with increased flooding and erosion. They've got to be looking at more protective infrastructures to help keep houses on the coast safe. And then there's also just something called climate gentrification, which I think is interesting. And the term, and one definition of the term is climate gentrification refers to the ways that climate impacts and adaptations may contribute to changes in community characteristics and potential displacement of vulnerable residents through changes in property values. And one person talks about how, according to one realtor online site, the more higher quality, more expensive housing tends to be built on the hillside. So they have this beautiful view of the ocean, and that leaves people on the lowlands, more the lower income folks, and they're more susceptible to the bad weather. If you go to, for a while I was thinking I wanted to move to Astoria, and sometimes I still do want to move to Astoria from St. Helens. But whenever I see a house that looks somewhat affordable for me, it's always right down on sea level. And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to risk that. So that's what we're seeing is more affordable housing is much closer. It's in those tsunami zones, those signs that you see when you go there. So just to kind of start wrapping up my wandering presentation, my belief is we need to take a holistic approach to the housing that's needed for everyone, housing that's affordable, and housing that is fair. If we can kind of look at where those three needs overlap and work in those intersections and slow down rather than hurry up and just develop because it's going to make a lot of money for some people, that's going to have a much more equitable effect on populations. And I chose this photograph in particular because you've got the ocean on one side with its rising sea levels, and you've got drier lands and forests and mountains on this side. So there's very little room when we're talking about, who's living on the coast. So I don't have a detailed plan myself for how to work in those intersections. It's just a vision for how we can think about and slow down and include everybody into the process. Gina and I were at the earlier at the what was the name of the Deacon Court presentation? Yeah, and it was all about getting resident participation in ideas. What do you want? What do you need? What's needed? And that I feel like is what needs to happen. I was telling somebody earlier that, and maybe this is just a little braggadocious alert, but a couple weekends ago, I hiked around Three Sisters. I'd done it 7 years before. And when I did it 7 years before, I was like, I hate this. I want to go as fast as I can because I hurt. And I was like, I'm not going to do that this time. It's not about getting it done. And so I was very mindful this time of like, I'm a tortoise, I'm not a hare. I'm a tortoise, I'm not a hare. And you know what? It made the trip so much more beautiful, so much more worthwhile, a little less sore, and now it's a positive memory. But I feel like that's kind of the spirit with which we need to be working on housing in these recreation counties and working with the long-term residents, not just the people who are coming over the range for a fun weekend, is we need to slow down the process in order to have a more effective, positive process and positive future. One thing I will mention briefly, and this really only counts for Astoria because it's the only town in these 3 recreation counties that has more than 10,000 people. And Sam, feel free to jump in if I get anything wrong. Just this past July, there was a legislation passed that said towns, 10,000 people and more, are now allowed to use what were single family lots to build smaller, so alternative housing. Could be a duplex, could be a triplex, could be a cluster of cottages, right? So that's going to create more density, but it's going to create more homes for more families. Every time I see a townhome coming up in St. Helens, and now that I work with Fair Housing Council of Oregon, I'm like, twice as many families, right? Twice as many families are being housed now. And so that's one thing that can be considered. And again, I don't know for smaller towns how that can work, but we need to be thinking of outside of the boxes of just those single family homes so that we can house more people and more equitably. This is just an idea of the kind of different approaches we need to, or places from which we need to look at this. Public policy, the brick and mortar issue, there's not a lot of space for housing. The community services, I didn't even mention, the people I work with, we need more mental health care in these areas. We need more things like family treatment court or something to help people recover from addictions. Instead of just deciding these are the riffraff and this is my nice town, let's help these folks get housed so that it's a beautiful place for everybody. Just coming back to the equity issue, we need to be thinking, who has had the ladder? Who needs the ladder? Let's work more equitably on making sure that the full-time residents, the people who have the long-term rentals in these areas, are getting access to the opportunities that they need. So just a little information. If you have any follow-up ideas or thoughts or want to talk to me or reach out to me, my name is Eliza Galaher. That's my email address. I do cover Columbia, Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. If you know of discrimination happening, you can report. You can go to fhco.org and hit the report housing discrimination tab, or you can go to inquiries@fhco.org. And there is a happy ending, hopefully. That is a vision, hopefully, for a happy ending. I would really appreciate it if you would complete evaluations. Those evaluations go back to HUD and let them know that we're doing the job that we're supposed to be doing. And also it helps me get feedback. So it is 2:28. I'm going to say, instead of questions for me, this can be a time for conversation. It could be, we can talk among each other. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts that they'd like to share? Okay. Okay, so the question was about seasonal homelessness in Florence specifically. I don't know if I can answer that question directly, but what I can tell you that I do know happens sometimes in places like Astoria is that people who are depending on motels for shelter, once the summer comes, that's when they become homeless because they don't even have that kind of alternative emergency shelter in motels, because the motels are like, nope, we're raising the costs and we're saving that space for tourists. Does Samuel or Gina, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm sorry, these are two of my coworkers. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If you don't, it's fine. I don't mean to put you on the spot. No, okay. Okay, so sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. Well, so that's the thing, is that I won't say there's an answer or a solution, because at least in Astoria, there are 3 shelters. One is just for women, and that includes cis women, trans women, and their children, and that's a domestic violence sexual assault shelter. Then there's a co-ed shelter So if you are a woman who's, a survivor of sexual assault, you probably don't want to go to a co-ed shelter. And then the other shelter, and this is words from somebody else, is so strict in its religious teachings that it will reject people if they don't follow those particular. So there's very limited homeless shelters in Clatsop County and Tillamook and Lincoln counties. So they're on the streets, they're camping. And then of course, who complains? The shop owners, the wealthy people in the town, or the tourist industry, people who don't want homeless people on the streets. So that's kind of the vicious cycle that happens. And that's why I say, we got to be more like the tortoise. Let's slow down, figure out how to help our people who are in houselessness and get them housed. I know one thing is turnkey is, I think they're trying to buy a motel in Seaside, which will help people, which will be a small help, but not help everybody. So it's a one small step.
Yeah. And I also want to thank you for bringing up environmental gentrification, because I follow a lot of that, like mostly on the East Coast. I'm watching like places like Miami, where a lot of the wealthy folks live on the water and now are moving inland and displacing low income folks. So I'm really glad to see that in part of your presentation here.
Thank you. Thank you. I highly recommend a podcast called Woke AF by Danielle Moody. I think that's where I heard that term. But yeah, when I went to Biloxi, Mississippi to do hurricane recovery work, same thing. This is back in 2005. They're like, what, we could build casinos here, right where these homes were ruined. We can bring in more a stronger economy if we just replace these homes where people live for generations. We'll just put a casino in. Thank you for raising that. Anybody have any thoughts, any questions, any gaps in my presentation you want to raise or anything? Yes, a gap.
Not a gap at all. I just want to say thank you for your presentation. I actually grew up in rural coastal Scotland, and it's just amazing how
we might be cousins.
quite possibly. And it's just incredible how similar the issues that are faced by rural areas that are very tourism dependent. And I wish I could say that everything's sorted out there and got all the answers to give to you, and unfortunately we don't. But it's just it was just really striking to me, your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciated like your personality that you brought into the workshop. Just like a little comment about in the beginning, when you referenced the Constitution, and how you were saying that you hope that they were talking about all people. I think that when you bring into the context that at that point they had been practicing the enslavement of people for over a century, and like the purposeful systematic displacement of like indigenous people and like massacres of people in general, that like it's a little painful that you said that. No, and
no, I am sorry. I apologize.
So yeah, that's all I had to say.
I really appreciate that. I did a presentation at Spectrum last week, and at one point, I was talking about these ideals of like, what is freedom, right? And there's this idea, this debate going on between the idea of freedom is actually exclusive. That means if I get my freedom, but you don't get it, right? And then there's the idea of collective, inclusive freedom. And that's kind of how I'm seeing the debate right now in the political world. Is there are these people who want exclusive freedom, which means if you get some freedom, then you're taking away mine. And that's a zero-sum game. And what I want to talk about is we need to strive toward collective freedom. So that's the glitch in our Declaration of Independence. Oh, so I was going to say, during that presentation, a woman raised her hand and she said, really, this is just all based on a lie. And that was just like, okay, the emperor has no clothes. The Constitution is based on a lie. Whether you want to call it that or fault lines or whatever, I do believe there are good ideas in it, but it's completely faulty, based on a lie and based on violence and genocide and enslavement. So I am sorry that I perpetuated any of that notion of we've got a good thing happening. Because I don't necessarily believe, especially at this point, we do. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, the term that I've heard for things like that is settler colonialism, which is still catching on. But to talk about colonialism where the colonizers don't leave and take the property and push people off. Anyway.
Yeah. Anybody? Yeah. You get a bonus point if you have a Scottish accent too.
Sadly, I don't.
Okay.
But my name is Patrick McGill.
Oh, that's
so
good.
That's
That's
kind
good.
of Scottish. So I work for a developer, and we just broke ground on an affordable housing project, LIHTC project in Lincoln City. And one thing that's notable about it is
that Wacoma Place?
It's not. It is Lincoln City 25th Street Apartments.
Okay.
It's off Highway 101.
Okay.
So that was notable because it happened because of sort of a public-private partnership. I'm wondering, since this is a known issue in the counties that you work in, how much appetite is there at the municipal or county commission level to, I guess, put forth either city property or funds toward affordable housing?
Well, I'll try not to name names, but one city, they were very close. They had developer, they were going to create this, they were going to use this vacant lot in the city to create affordable housing. That some of the units were going to be reserved for people in behavioral health care, and it was a really extraordinary project. I loved the vision, but there were the powerful voices in the town said it's going to ruin our parking. It's going to ruin the culture of downtown. And the city council, who had been supporting the project all along, suddenly decided, nope, it's not going to work. So there's things like that. And then another town, I invited the city council to do a fair housing training. And and they said, well, we politely declined because we don't really have any part in enforcing fair housing laws. And I pointed out to them that actually I was just wanting them to know how to comply with fair housing laws, because jurisdictions have to comply with fair housing laws. No response. So that's kind of the pushback I get. County commissioners in one county, totally gung-ho with the short-term rentals and just, no cap, nothing. So I see generally, and I've only been doing this work for a little while, but I see generally a very pro tourist industry. We are the playground for the people attitude among most county commissioners and city councils.
So there's a question from the chat. Are there any federal or state resources to aid the construction of affordable housing on the coast? There are affordable projects happening in Portland, but I'm not seeing the same push in the coast, though I might have missed those projects. Thank you.
And thank you. I didn't mention, I was going to, but there is, I mentioned the Wacoma place. So Yahat's News talked about a 44-unit apartment project, Lincoln City project called Wacoma Place, that I believe was going to be, it's publicly, federally funded. So there are, and I don't know enough of where'd you go? I'm like trying to look back to you. There is federal funding. I'm not well versed enough to be able to answer that question very precisely, honestly. I think sometimes the rural counties, Portland just gets more attention. There's more focus on Portland. So I don't think sometimes it's just a matter of visibility and visibility. Any other questions? I think we're just about wrapped up. Yes.
Hi, I have a small relocation company.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I saw what company?
I have a small relocation company.
Uh-huh.
We're going to be doing a job on the coast. We're going to have to try and source housing for people. And I'm terrified about it because it's going to take place over the summer and I don't know where we're going to put people. But that wasn't what I wanted to say. I was mentored into this work by a woman who is a writer and a civil rights activist based in Oregon. And when she wanted to stop doing relocations and wanted to retire, she taught me how to do this work. And also my colleague, John here. Her mentor was Raymond Carver. So thank you.
I love that.
Yeah.
Full circle. Thank you.
Also, if anybody has any tips on housing at the coast for me, happy to take them.
All right, I think that about wraps it up. I'm very aware. I just want to apologize one more time for my any insensitivity about our history, our country's history with slavery and genocide. I want to hold that up because we're cracking as a country right now, I think, and we need to be taking a real serious look at our history and owning it and not being worried about our white children being uncomfortable in school with learning our real history. So thank you. If and one more thing, if you can fill out an evaluation, if I gave you one, please do.